Let me thank you all for coming tonight on such a beautiful evening. I want to thank the Friends of the Library who make these programs possible. At the end of the program, we'll take Q&A, and Uli will also address some questions as we go along. So keep them coming. So let me tell you a little bit about Uli Lorimer. Is the Director of Horticulture for Native Plant Trust in Framingham, Massachusetts. The Native Plant Trust is the nation's first plant conservation organization and the only one solely focused on New England's native plants. He oversees the facilities and operations at the Garden in the Woods and at Nasami Farm. Uli brings 20 years of experience working with native plants in public gardens, with previous positions at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, Wave Hill Garden, and the U.S. National Arboretum. He is a tireless advocate for the use of native plants in designing spaces, and he speaks often public speaking, writing, lectures, media appearances, and not surprisingly, Uli is most happy when his hands are covered in soil and keeping himself grounded. Take another look at the cover, and we'll be back at the end of the program for all your questions. So welcome, Uli. Have a great program.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm just going to share my screen and we can get started. Okay. So welcome everyone for joining me this afternoon, or this evening rather. I know it is an equally lovely evening here in Framingham, Massachusetts, and I'm very appreciative that you choose to spend your time listening to me talk about my book. I'm going to start off with giving a little credit where credit is due, and to talk about the women in my life who gave me my green thumb. And specifically my mother, or seen on the right-hand side here, her mother, and on the left-hand side, and my wife in the middle, all have had a relatively profound impact on my career choices and on my love of plants. My family moved to the US when I was about 5 from Germany, and I have a lot of really fond memories as a kid going on nightly slug hunts with my grandmother. She lived in northern Germany, and her garden abutted a number of cow pastures, and every night in summertime the slugs would march across the cow pastures and into my grandmother's garden in search of her most delectable plants. And we would go around with a flashlight and a pail and a trowel and make sure that not too much was eaten. But you know, as a child, I had a real kind of boyish enthusiasm for the natural world. When we moved to the U.S., we lived in Wilmington, Delaware, and only about 10 or 15 minutes away from Longwood Gardens, which is a pretty famous garden. And so, as you can see, I spent a lot of time with my older sister running around Longwood Gardens. And I'd like to think that those early experiences really helped push me in the right direction. There was a couple of years that we spent living in Tucson, Arizona, which was also sort of exposing me to different plant communities, different kinds of plants. And I'd like to think that as an adult, I haven't lost that boyish enthusiasm for the natural world, whether it's allowing praying mantises to crawl on my face, looking at salamanders, or extolling the virtues of sedges to my interns. I still really get excited about plants and about all the connections to the natural world at which plants sit at the center. So all of that enthusiasm and sort of, you know, real positive interest, I've tried to channel into this book. And I think that the message for using native plants really has to be one of inspiration and hope. And I really, truly believe in the 2 sentences that you see on the screen right now. I don't think that you earn a lot of converts to native plants by telling people that they're doing it wrong, or garden shaming, if you'd like. And so I think being inspirational and giving people a sense that even the choices in their gardens can all add up to a larger, more positive effect in our regional ecosystems is a very powerful thing. And so these native plants, they do have this wonderful power to not only connect us and serve as a bridge between the wonders of the natural world, but can also really heal our landscapes, which are in much need of healing, facing things like climate change, invasive species, habitat loss. We really need to find a way to live side by side with nature in a very intentional way. So some of the challenges that I looked to tackle with this book is to explain why ecological horticulture is important. And if I could sum it up, I would say that ecological horticulture is an approach that elevates ecological function, and elevates it to be equally weighted with aesthetics. So what we're saying here is that you can have beautiful gardens full of color and texture, but also chosen because the plants that make up your garden support the widest variety and most diversity of insect life and bird life and all the other connections that that these plants support. Part of this message is also to gently push back against neat and tidy, and I think neat and tidy is a direct holdover of European gardens and formal gardens. And you see it played out a lot in suburban landscapes where folks have big lawns, lots of mulch, and very neatly clipped geometric shrubs. Excuse me. And I think all of that approach is not only really resource heavy to maintain that way, but it's also sort of anathema to ecology. It's not what Mother Nature does. It's not what Mother Nature wants. Reducing lawns is certainly another big part of this, and I won't spend too much time on that. But it can be really overwhelming. And I think that it's important for everyone listening to really embrace that success in gardening, if you'd like, and it comes and is measured over seasons and years. It's not something that you can install and walk away. And so I think in that is it because we know that change comes slowly. For me, it makes the enormity of the challenge a little bit more doable if you think, hey, I can chip away at this over a long period of time. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So there is a sense of urgency. I think that the messaging around native plants and their importance has really filtered through to much more public channels. It's not something just restricted to native plant symposia and native plant societies and so forth. And I think that if the time isn't now, then when would it be? It's never too late to begin welcoming native plants into your garden. And really, I say that very specifically because we want folks to welcome those plants in, even if it's just one at a time, and observe what happens and see if the presence of this particular plant, or maybe 5 new plants, increases the insect diversity that comes to your garden, perhaps draws more bird life in, and that decision should empower you to continue on that journey towards more natives in your gardens, and less non-natives, and certainly far less known invasive plants. But again, we'll speak about that in a little bit too. So there's been, I'd say, over the last few years, a real remarkable interest, a surge in interest in native plants, and a surge in interest in gardening in general. And I attribute that to a couple of different things. So first, there is a real tangible anxiety that people feel around the uncertainty of the future. We don't know what future climate will bring. We don't know when there will be serious droughts and heat waves, nor do we know when we'll have wet periods or even winters without any snow. I mean, all of this is very kind of new territory, and it's a little unnerving, particularly if you're used to a more consistent rhythm to the seasons. There's plenty of bad news out in the world and out in various other places about declines in insect populations and fungi and amphibians and birds and so forth. But I don't want to dwell on all of those things. I know when I go back to Delaware on occasion that some of the areas I knew from my childhood are unrecognizable. Many of the small woodlots and little parks have now been converted into more housing or box stores. And there's this overall perception that wild areas are shrinking and getting smaller and smaller. And then I think all of that, for some people, leads them to have this real desire to do something positive. And I think that's really at the heart of this message, is that using native plants is really a forward-thinking act and a courageous act. And you really want to do something to support wildlife and to support Mother Earth. I want to take a minute to go off on a little bit of a tangent and talk about loss of biodiversity. I mean, this is certainly, I think, of the two crises that we face in the future, one being climate change, I think the other is loss of biodiversity. And I think that we can shift our perspective a little bit in looking at biodiversity in the following way. This is a relatively new concept, only a couple of years old. And what it does is it challenges a little bit about what exactly is biodiversity. So how we define it is as a total, quantitative measure of the number of different things in a given landscape. So if I were to look at this beautiful scene from Kennebunk Plains in Maine, and I put my botanist hat on and I could identify all the plants in here, and I'd say, okay, you have 187 species of plants here, which is pretty impressive. But it doesn't tell you anything about the relative abundance of any one of those things. You could have one particularly common plant and it counts as one, or you could have one really rare plant and 10,000 invasives individuals, and you would still have a biodiversity total of 2. So I think the idea of proportionality is, it asks the question of how much of any one individual plant is really needed in order for it to be able to thrive and adapt and change in the face of climate change. And I think that we don't have all the answers of, like, if that's a number, is it 10,000, is it 100,000? But how that translates to the home gardener, I think, is that if you choose to include native plants in your garden, plant a lot of them, not just one of many different ones, but a lot of maybe 5 different ones. Or in other words, think about proportion of the plants in addition to species diversity. And if you plant 10 goldenrods and your neighbor plants 10 goldenrods, and the folks down the end of the road plant 100 goldenrods, and that connects with the 10,000 in the old hay field that's just further down the road, that all adds up to a larger number of individuals that can interact with one another and adapt and hopefully pass on good adaptations. The other aspect of this, I think, is that biodiversity is oftentimes used to justify the destruction of one place as long as something equivalent exists somewhere else. And I think that's real, that's a false dichotomy. I think that just in the same way, cutting down a mature oak tree and promising to plant a young new one is not a one-for-one swap. And each landscape in each place is unique in terms of the proportion of the plants that are there and the ability for them to support a broad spectrum of life. So just really introducing the idea and trying to get folks' wheels turning a little bit about bioproportionality, because I think it's a really neat concept. The other way in which we can look at the popularity of native plants is measuring it through their use and popularity in public spaces. Increasingly, many states, particularly the Northeast, our DOTs are looking at ways to transition highway medians and rights of way to support pollinators, to cut their costs in terms of mowing and resources and fossil fuels. Pollinator pathways are all over the place. I know in Connecticut, there are some excellent local pollinator pathways who look to connect townships and municipalities and natural spaces with corridors of floral resources that will support our threatened pollinators. One of my staff members was involved in a successful municipal ordinance in the city of Somerville in Massachusetts. And it was a maybe 2 or 3 year effort that resulted in a wonderful ordinance that now has legislated the use of native plants in any new plantings in public spaces in Somerville. Solar farms are interested. Schools and universities, we've partnered with Smith College to host plantings on their campus that are designed entirely to produce native plant seeds. So, and we're very excited with the potential of this partnership because it engages the next generation of environmental stewards and gets the student body involved in real hands-on plant conservation initiatives. Nearly every botanic garden that I visit has some sort of native plant display. National parks and state parks increasingly embracing native plant displays, even shopping centers and corporate parks. Green infrastructure, certainly, green roofs are no longer just for succulents and sedums. There's a wonderful project if anybody's interested in looking it up. It's at the Kingsland Wastewater Treatment Center. It's in Brooklyn, New York, and they have a wildflower meadow on the roof of this facility, and it is absolutely gorgeous. In the private sphere, we see increasingly more and more homeowners making these decisions to transition turf or non-native plantings to more natives. This article, while it is about a year old, I think is a good tale of a particular couple in Maryland that turned their front lawn into a pollinator habitat, and the resulting 3-year legal battle they faced with their homeowners association in fighting being told that their lawn, their landscape had to look like everybody else's with a neat and tidy lawn. They ended up winning against the homeowners association, but it took quite a bit of legal intervention, and that can be costly, as well as the intervention of the state senate in Maryland that weighed in on behalf of this couple. So a really interesting article. To add to that, we have a whole new generation up and coming generation of landscape architects and designers that are really emphasizing and centering ecology and native plants to their practices. During the pandemic, Native Plant Trust, for example, saw a sustained 25 to 30% surge in interest in registration in our educational offerings in 2019, 2020, 21, 22. It has continued to grow exponentially as more and more people are becoming aware of and interested in welcoming these plants into their landscapes. If you had asked me 10 years ago, would I have thought that native plants would grace the front covers of nationally syndicated gardening publications, I would have said, no way. These are usually back of issue fodder, maybe tucked in right behind the index. But as you can see here from 2021 and 2022, front and center, best native perennials, all-star native selections. So the hort industry is sort of also waking up to this. American Gardener here with an article about native annuals. And if you can see down at the bottom, Outwitting Weed Laws is another article about how to approach homeowner associations. So how many folks knew that April is Native Plant Month, National Native Plant Month? Probably not very many, but this was an example in 2022 of I would say, rare example of bipartisanship at the national level. And this was unanimously passed and approved in the Senate to make April 2022 National Native Plant Month. I'm happy to say that April of 2023 was similarly designated. And this is a really wonderful initiative, not just from the two senators that you see here too, but it's supported by the Garden Clubs of America. And I can't speak highly enough of the Garden Clubs of America as a force to be reckoned with. They are now contacting all of the governors in all of the states in which their clubs are active, and have successfully, I believe, in most of New England, gotten the governors to also designate April as Native Plant Month, which is really wonderful for exposure and programming and really pushing this message forward on a much broader platform. Lastly, Forbes magazine, sort of the last place that I would expect to see any kind of native plant articles, but here it is talking about this hot new trend and big shift to native plants. And it's an article about a nursery owner in Tennessee who transitioned to all native plants, the wonderful reception that her customers gave, and that she's now involved quite a bit more with restoration projects throughout the state. And it's just all wonderful and positive all around. So with all this renewed interest in native plants, clearly people are going out shopping and trying to find native plants. And so plant sales are growing. In Massachusetts, we've had two, and actually now this year, I should add, 3 new native plant nurseries that are entirely focused on growing native plants. Our own operation at Nasami Farm and Garden in the Woods has seen a sustained 25–30% increase in sales in the past years. And I'm happy to report that last year we topped $1 million in sales for native plants, which was something that, again, 5 years ago, even 10 years ago, was unthinkable. So these are really, we're having good problems in that we're running out of places to put the plants because so many people want to buy them. So, which sort of begs the question of why is it so hard to find native plants? The total hort industry is a pretty big business, you know, nearly $350 billion. And, you know, as of 2010, it was roughly 13% of total sales. I imagine that may be closer to 25% at this point, but it's still only 25%. And surveys reveal that the reason why more plants are not sold, native plants, is because they're not available. Consumer preference pushes in one direction, and certainly knowledge of native plants is another one. Add to that aggressive and misleading marketing and really poor labels on information make it hard to make informed and good choices about what sorts of plants to get. So one of the big bottlenecks for native plants in the nursery trade is the availability of seed. That many of the nurseries that promote using native plants tend to be smaller, they tend to lack capital. It's really difficult for an operation that sells maybe 100,000 plugs a year to compete with something on the scale of Monrovia or Pride's Corner or one of the larger nurseries, industrial scale nurseries that exist. Mount Cuba Center conducted a little bit of a survey a few years ago at wholesale nurseries and discovered that 3/4 of what they offer are non-natives. And I zero in on wholesale nurseries because that's where the folks that landscape the shopping centers and the corporate parks and office parks and people who install landscapes for new subdivisions and real estate operations all tend to go to wholesale nurseries. So if 3 out of 4 of their choices is non-native, then it shouldn't be a surprise that that's mostly what gets planted. And nobody seems to care about provenance. So case study for you here is what's called the Sugar Buzz series. These are names that I feel like should be more appropriate in a candy shop, but they're all various versions of a Monarda and different versions of pink. Because these are patented plants, they're all grown by cuttings and not by seed. And the information they give you is pretty bland. You know, I would say that it's native to North America. Well, that's pretty great. So when we focus in on cultivars, and it's a little bit of a tangent here, but the book really recommends only using species. And cultivars, when we change the color and the shape and the timing of the flower, it may negatively impact insects that rely on eating those things, particularly if the foliage color has been altered to red and purple. Other research here shows that pollinators tend to prefer the species, although there were a few cultivars that were outliers. Similarly with shrubs. And so when I say shopping for plants, I think the best options here are, as you can see, use species and seed grown if you can, and try to stay away from known invasives. Again, 70% native is this really wonderful thing to aim for, that allows for a lot of the non-native plants that are known to play nice. But like I said, change comes slowly, and everybody's on their own journey towards this sort of 2/3 goal. So why is provenance important? And this is another thing that I think it needs to be kind of brought into this. Provenance is important because it's sort of a record of the beginning of something's existence. It's a chain of documentation. So when we think about plants that are from different parts of the country, I like thinking of growing degree days. And so this is a little look at the average number of days above freezing in different parts across the country. So if you live in Florida, well, it almost never freezes. And that allows you to grow a wide variety of things. If you live in Maine, you've got just about 5 months above freezing, which means that all the plants that you can grow in Maine also need to be able to come out of the ground, set flower, be pollinated, make seed, and disperse their seed in a much shorter period of time than something in, let's say, Richmond or even in Charleston. And when you mix plants, when you bring plants that are originally from Richmond, for example, and you plant them up in Maine, they struggle because they're not adapted to a shorter season and different growing conditions. And this is what the core of the concept of local ecotype is. It's adapted to the local conditions. It maintains all of those existing relationships that you didn't know might be there. And most importantly, it also really draws in the genetic diversity that exists within our local regions. And generally, if you site them properly, they'll require less resources. So species and provenance have this wonderful choreography here with generalists and specialists. All of these were snapped in one day at Garden in the Woods, just to show you some of the diversity of plant species of insects that can come to a single plant. And for them, it's a very simple interaction of plants and pollination, and insects and pollination, both serving each other's needs. So the more species rich you can plant in your gardens, the more pollinators you can draw to them, and that increases all of those resources up through the food chain. I think that pollinator gardens are really, really wonderful ways to approach this, but oftentimes we're too focused just on the bees and the butterflies that we want to attract. The butterflies need host plants to become butterflies. And so I would urge you, if you're planning to design pollinator gardens, to make sure you add some host plants as well. Some of these relationships are incredibly species specific. Others are a little more generalist. So there's other things other than monarchs that eat milkweeds. And of course, the monarchs are very popular. Turtle heads, which are wonderful to watch. Bees struggle, are the sole food source for Baltimore checker spots. So if you want to see these guys, we're drawing all these connections together. And these connections expand beyond just pretty bees and butterflies to include spiders like this crab spider and these goldenrod crab spiders that can turn their body color in 3 days from white to yellow in order to waylay pollinators and other things. So A lot of the plants that are listed in the book, and there's sort of a special section about whether these support generalist pollinators or specialists. And the specialists are ones that have dietary restrictions. I mean, we can all understand having allergies to specific things and not being able to eat certain foods or only requiring certain foods. And this is the same thing for specialist pollinators. They tend to be smaller in size. They're solitary, so these are not your bumblebees or your honeybees. And they're much more sensitive to changes on the landscape. The following list of things, I'm going to flash through a lot of plants here, but these will support not only generalists, but also specialists. In the carrot family, the asters, we have lots of asters, and we've included quite a number of asters into the book, but also annuals and things like fleabane are incredibly important. Coreopsis, let's see what else we have. Rudbeckias, black-eyed Susans, sunflowers, blazing stars, thistles, sneezeweeds, ironweeds. Boy, we have a lot of really wonderful goldenrods in our region here. Joe pie weeds are great. Beggars, ticks, bonesets, and groundsels. From the heath family, we've got all number of beautiful mountain laurels and azaleas and rhododendrons, all of whom will serve this purpose. Even if you like to have a little snack from your garden, blueberries and cranberries not only provide delicious fruit for us, but they provide the right kinds of pollen and nectar for those specialists. Monardas, a lot of our native loosestripes are important for oil and sweat and resin bees. You know, there's a long list of things here. Many of these plants listed in the book. Violets, boy, I love violets. They are fantastic plants, cheerful, colorful, easy to edit out if they become too exuberant, and just wonderful and cheerful, especially this time of the year. Plants for nectar, plants that have, for insects that have long tongues. Monkey flowers, these are tubular shaped plants. Agastaches and wild baptisias, dragon heads, and these are all wonderful to support nectar plants. And then some of our St. John's worts are wonderful for pollen plants. The other reason to plant natives, again, because no other group will support as many insects as our natives do. And what likes to eat insects, particularly in the springtime? It's our songbirds. 96% of our songbirds require insects to successfully rear chicks. And we are smack dab in the middle of this wonderful Atlantic flyway here. And it's a big reason why so many wonderful birds stop through our landscapes. And we want to make sure that we can lure some of them to stay and nest in our garden as opposed to moving on to other folks. Just to quantify this, a pair of Carolina chickadees needs between 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise young, which is absolutely astounding. So really here you're aiming for 70% native, seed grown if you can do it, avoiding using pesticides. If you have poor soils, they are a gift. So all of those things put together was kind of what motivated me to make this book and to make it inspirational. We introduced the concept of ecoregions. So this is a different way of looking at native plants that isn't defined by arbitrary political boundaries. Our plants don't care if they grow in Connecticut or Rhode Island or Massachusetts or New York State. And they're much more distributed and aligned based on soil type and geology, plant community type, plant use, water, hydrology. I mean, all these natural things are what help shape our landscapes and what plants can be distributed where. And this, all of those factors were sort of put together to make what are called ecoregions. And so this is an adaptation from ecoregions, which you can find if you look for or do a Google search of EPA ecoregions. You'll find some really cool maps of the entire country where there are 4 different levels, each increasingly more granular. This one is based on level 3. But really what it shows you is that there are really significant similarities between some of these regions, especially if they span multiple states. So the example that I can use is the Atlantic coastal pine barrens. And so if anybody's ever spent time on the Cape in Massachusetts, on Long Island, or in southern New Jersey, you'll know that they are characterized by sandy soils and lots of oak and pine trees and a particular kind of plant community that doesn't exist anywhere else. So the idea behind this is really to help you define what is regionally appropriate. If you know where your plants are from, then the wisdom is to source within your ecoregion if possible. I know it's a lot since we don't have all the transparency and information from the nursery side of things, but as an introductory concept, it was really important that it make it into the book. Next, I like to put into a little bit of ecology into plant selection. And what I'm really talking about here is that some of our native plants are early successional plants. And what this means is that they have evolved to occupy a stage in plant succession where they are shade intolerant, they grow vigorously, they either make lots of rhizomes or they seed themselves in everywhere. And what they're doing is preparing the soil and the space for the next iteration of this succession. And if all the humans disappeared, well, most of New England would go back to being woodland. And this is the process that plays out. So an abandoned farm field is usually first covered with early successional plants or rudderals or annuals. While they are fantastic plants, they need space to spread and they're very competitive. And knowing that, they would be ill-suited for a smaller garden. I think I use Canada goldenrod as the example. If you had wanted a goldenrod that stayed put and you planted Canada goldenrod, you'd probably be really disappointed because it would overwhelm your garden very quickly. Welcoming life in the garden is fairly easy. You want 3-dimensional structure. You want trees, you want shrub layers, and you want to cover the ground in mulch. Excuse me, to not cover the ground in mulch. You want to cover it in plants. Rather than spending money on mulch, we've got wonderful ground covers, and these are also listed in the book, that can hold the space and provide resources and habitat for lots of different insects. As I said, it's time that our gardens we can't just have gardens that are pretty anymore. They really need to be functional as well. I made a wonderful collage in the book trying to show some of the ugly pollinators, if you'd like. So it's not just, again, about pretty bees and butterflies, but that organisms like these flies, like harvestmen or daddy longlegs, or even cicada killers, all are in service of pollination of this wonderful vine that produces those wonderful fluffy seed heads. And what I find even greater is that the seed heads are used by goldfinches in the springtime to line their nests because they're so fluffy and wonderful. And it's just this really elegant circle of life that I think that these plants sit at the center of. Lawn care is big business, $105 billion a year. They tend to be ecological deserts, in other words, dominated by a few species that don't really have a whole lot to offer. And so my suggestion is you don't need to wholesale rip out your lawn, but consider diversifying it. Plant in some violets or some wild strawberries or some bluets or something, just to give it a little bit of some floral resources. I also really think that crocus and some of the non-native minor bulbs are really fantastic in lawns because they come up really before you need to mow your lawn in the first place. and they provide color and interest and floral resources for some of those early appearing pollinators. As I said before, the book makes a specific point of only offering species. And I think if you value ecological function, no one does it better than Mother Nature. And so I think that we oftentimes think that we're improving upon plants because we select for shorter plants or bigger blooms, or in this case, double flowers. But I think it robs those plants of their ability to adapt if they don't have the genetic diversity of their wild cousins. I love lists, so I put a number of lists into the book here that give you different categories, including host plants for caterpillars and moths. I think this is also important, going back to my pollinator garden comment. The book has 235 plant profiles with all of this information on here, and then these lovely little icons that can tell you whether or not the particular plant in question is used by birds, either as food or shelter, nesting, seed dispersal, whether it supports generalists and specialists, whether it is a host. And my personal favorite is the little froggy, which says, hey, you know what, mammals and reptiles and amphibians, they use these plants too. And so if you're looking to support those groups of organisms, there's good plants in the book in there as well. So here are two examples for you. Are two aronias, red chokecherry and black chokeberry, that both have all 5 icons. So they're really 4-season plants that have tremendous ecological value. And you'll see as you read through the different profiles, I really try to weave through and stress their value in the profile, in the paragraphs themselves. And it's a theme that really plays itself out through all of the profiles, whether it's vines, wildflowers, which of course are the largest section within the book, and even in annuals. And I think this is a chapter that caught a lot of people by surprise, that we actually have really wonderful native annuals, and that they can be used in gardens, but that folks need to understand that they're not meant to be long-term members of any planting. They germinate quickly, they flower freely, and then they seed themselves around. Sometimes they stick around, sometimes they move to the path edges, sometimes they disappear altogether, but particularly if you're putting in new plantings, including annuals is a really smart move, and they also have loads of ecological value as well. So I'm winding up here and to say that you know, anybody who really loves gardening understands that it's an investment for the future. Just as planting a tree now and knowing that you may never live to see it reach its full glory and maturity is a really forward-thinking act. And I think about some of the great parks that were designed and that really show the vision of the designers 100 years or 150 years later in what they had envisioned. And I'll leave you with this, you know, these 2 quotes from the book, and I'll summarize them here. So we're really not looking to recreate conditions of the past. I think that's not feasible. And I'd rather focus our attention on being forward-thinking and thinking that using native plants as considering them as an act of compassion to help the remaining flora and fauna survive in a very fast-changing world. Some folks say that using species is limiting or elitist, and I think you have to question your values. What are you gardening just for yourself, or does your garden, is it connected to the broader ecosystem, and does it serve a larger purpose than just making you happy? I mean, it should do both, frankly. But if you challenge that and you look at those and you ask yourself some hard questions, and frankly, what I'm aiming at here is much of the environmental woes that we face today are self-inflicted by humans. And that viewed through this lens, using native plants and native species specifically is an act of liberation for nature. It's not a shackle. It's not something that is limiting. And it shows that you place value in the ability of future generations to take advantage of the same benefits and privileges of biodiversity that we and our ancestors have enjoyed. So I hope that you feel specifically inspired to welcome more native plants into your landscapes. And just as a final message, that our choices do matter. We do not live in a vacuum, nor do we garden in a vacuum. And collectively, we can all do our part towards a brighter future for our kids and grandkids and great-great-grandkids moving forward. So with that, I will say thank you very much for listening. And I'm happy to stop sharing and answer some of the questions that are coming in.
Can you see those, Uli, or would you like me to read them to you?
I'll start with the ones in the Q&A, because I think those came in first. So we have one question asking if I could clarify what I mean when you say poor soils are a gift. First, anonymous attendee, thank you for that question. I put that in there oftentimes as a little bit of a bait, because it almost always elicits a question of, well, what do you mean? And so what I mean here is that many of our native plants don't want to grow in the same soils that you would have your vegetables growing in. I think we have a mentality, a deep-seated mentality, that we need to amend the soils, we need to add compost, we need to add organic matter and make it this really dark, rich soil, which I think is, again, it taps into our agrarian background in history. But poor soils, think of areas that are called barrens. So things that are called barrens were also, they were designated as such because they wouldn't grow traditional crops. But I would argue that some of those areas are some of the most biodiverse in the world and have some of the most amazing, cool plants growing there that are adapted to really poor soils, very sandy, very rocky, fast draining. These are the things that if you have those conditions naturally occurring in your garden, you have an opportunity to make a garden that doesn't look like anybody else's, and that's full of some really, really cool stuff. And so that's why that is in there. And it challenges this deep-seated accepted notion that all soils need to be improved or amended upon to get them to be suitable to grow crops in. So I hope that answers your question. Next, we've got Lois Schneider asking about a Pachysandra that's being overrun by fungus. Well, if it's the Asian Pachysandra, I would definitely recommend that you pull that out as much as possible. There are any number of natives that could replace it with. Things like wild bleeding heart, ferns, wild geranium, some of our groundsels, the Pachara aurea or Pachara obovata, are really wonderful choices for spring bloomers. Heart-leafed aster, well, wreath goldenrod. I mean, there's a lot of choices in the perennials and wildflower section that I think could help you with your transition away from the Pachysandra. Next, we've got, it looks like, so from Juliet Grantham, she writes, it looks like Framingham, Massachusetts is in our ecoregion for Connecticut. Would Nasami Farm have appropriate natives grown from seed for our area in Connecticut? Yes, absolutely they would. I think that Nasami Farm is a good resource. I would also point folks to Eco 59, which is a good organic farmer-led initiative that's producing seeds. And what else? Color blends, I think, is also in Connecticut. My intern from last year is working there, and they're really trying to do really good stuff with seed-grown natives as well. I mean, I think if you look at it, you know, the resource section in the back of the book, this book was written in 2020 in the depths of the pandemic. And since then, a number of new nurseries have popped up, not only in Massachusetts, but also in Connecticut, that are really focused on natives. So I would, you know, if you find things, share it with other folks, tell folks about it, because these new nurseries, these startups, they need the support in order to continue to be successful. Following that question here, besides eastern red oak and white oak, can you tell us some other trees that you'd recommend for our backyards here in Connecticut? Well, trees, and I'm glad you mentioned oaks, because I assume everyone has heard about Doug Tallamy or the Homegrown National Park Initiative. And Doug is right to target oaks as real keystone species, as a workhorse species, because of just the sheer breadth of insect diversity that they support and life that they support. And so I think that they are always great choices. Aside from that, you know, just because it's spring and ours are really coming into bloom right now, I think flowering dogwoods are always a great addition to landscapes and backgrounds. I would mention that flowering dogwoods tend to be very shallow rooted, so you need to be careful about underplanting or mulching them too thickly. Aside from that, I think other common plants, you know, sugar maples or black maple are great choices. Let's see what else. Yeah, there's, you know, I gave a podcast interview earlier today, and I was asked to pick a favorite native plant, and it was sort of like being asked to pick a favorite child. It's really difficult to do. And I think that a big reason why I haven't gone completely over every page of the book is that I would love folks to buy the book or to rent it and look at all the suggestions yourself. There's a long section on trees there, so but I'll stick with dogwoods as my one suggestion for now. And red buds aren't bad either. So any alternatives to mulch that will still make our backyards look finished? Well, I think there are good ground covers. So things like barren strawberry, things like, let's see, wild ginger, asarum. There are a number of good creeping, you know, ground covers that as long as you plant enough of them, they'll have the same consistent look as the mulch does. I think the reason why people like mulch is because they think the mulch is what ties the whole bed together, because it's all, you know, dark colored. And what I would argue is, why not use something living to tie it together? It's just a question of planting sufficient numbers of them to do that. There's also a number of different ferns that I really like because they spread. Some ferns are clump forming and are really great for accents within perennial planting. Others have rhizomes and will fill in and form almost little monocultures in their own right. And I think a nice bank of ferns goes a long way to making your backyard look finished. And ferns have the added bonus that the deer won't eat them. I'd like to turn now to our anonymous attendee with another question here about favorite native annuals and strategies on how to grow them. So I really like, if you have shady, wet areas, I really like jewelweed. Jewelweed is an impatient species, and it is guaranteed to draw hummingbirds. And the seeds, if you can get them established, the seeds are explosively dehiscent. In other words, The seed capsule is under tension, and if you brush against it, the seed capsule will explode and fling the plant seed out a little bit. And I just think it's a really wonderful thing to engage kids with, because who doesn't like, things pipping and popping all over the place. I think the trouble with some of these is sourcing the native annuals. In terms of getting them established, you can take two tracks. You can directly sow them, or you can sow them into plug trays outside and let them germinate. Particularly if you get seed in the fall, I would recommend what's called sort of slow gardening. Is get a seed plat, some hardware cloth to make sure that the rodents don't dig it up, and sow your seeds, and then leave it outside over the winter. And those seeds will get the cold exposure that they need, and then you'll be amazed at what comes up with very little effort on your own in the springtime. And then once those little guys are big enough to handle, you can tease them apart and start planting them out. If you choose to directly sow into a plug tray, then all you have to do is wait for the plug to be rooted in, and then you can pop it out and plant it anywhere you like. The idea being that they'll seed themselves around and you'll have sort of a reoccurring population. Or I would suggest collecting seeds from your own annuals and starting the process again.
We had a question that came in earlier saying, where do you start if you have approximately 1/8 of an acre that is wild with some trees, but do you pull out everything there and start all over again?
No, I think you need to start with an assessment of what you have. And I tend to, and this goes again back to the whole change comes slowly. We oftentimes fall into this installation mentality, which is I'll just zero it out and install everything at once, and then it's good to go. I find working with the landscape on a much longer time scale tends to result in better plants and better choices. So if you have native tree cover, then you don't need to remove anything. If you have invasives like Norway maple, for example, then consider removing those. Similarly, if you have invasive shrubs, then consider removing those and replacing them with an appropriate native shrub. This approach is also good because it doesn't strain your financial resources all at once. And then you can learn to see what works, what you like. You can take your time with sourcing it rather than saying, oh, I need to rip everything out and then put it all back in at once. And I think it gets you more involved and more attuned into what's happening on your 1/8 of an acre as you observe it, and you write down and note what you're seeing and what you like and what you don't like, and you can make better choices that way.
We also had a question, are ferns dividable?
So the ones that are spreading, I would say yes, you can. So things like hay-scented fern or sensitive fern are two relatively popular or very common ferns. So you can take a clump and you can dig it up, and you'll see the rhizomes, and you can chop them into different pieces and spread them out that way. Generally, taking a fern that's coming out of a single clump and putting a spade through the middle like you would to a hosta is a recipe to kill that fern. Ferns, again, are also something that really require patience. It takes a long time to grow ferns, and they do tend to grow slowly. But if you want to make more, start with the ones that spread naturally through surface rhizomes, and you can always chop those up and spread them up a little bit further and quickly rather than dividing a single clump.
Someone also asked, are blue flag irises readily available at nurseries?
Some carry them. It depends on the nursery. frankly. I know that we carry it at Asami Farm and at Garden in the Woods. You're really going to have to ask. There are a lot of other great irises out there. The only thing that I would say is please don't plant the yellow flag iris pseudochorus, because that is a known invasive. But you have to do a little bit more research, but it is available. It shouldn't be too hard to find.
Well, we're coming to the end of the hour, but I want to show everyone the book cover again, the Northeast Native Plant Primer. Barrett Bookstores, I believe, has it. They should have it. We saw so many great pictures, and it's really such a reference. And I want to thank Uli for spending some time with us. This is recorded, so it'll be up on our YouTube channel shortly. And thank you all for coming. And Uli, thank you especially for spending an hour with us and making us smarter.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure and an honor. And thank you all for listening. Go Native.
Bravo. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you soon.